Long Way Round. Prologue. Saturday, July 11th, 1987. Dusk, approximately 8:30 p.m. The road flare had about 20 minutes left in it. Cole Decker had been watching it die for the last half mile. The chemical light dropping from orange-red to a dull rust color. The smoke thickening at the top. He held it down at his side, because a man walking toward his own burning hand was nobody's idea of useful. When it went out, he'd have the edge of the blacktop, and whatever dusk light filtered through the canopy, and the sound of the creek on his right to keep him oriented. That was the inventory. He'd worked with less. He'd left the truck maybe 40 minutes ago, still in real daylight, confident the way a man gets confident on long flat roads where nothing surprises him anymore. A mile, 2 at the outside. Someone would be out this way. Farms, a house, a gas station. The road had to go somewhere. The road had gone somewhere, deeper in. He'd counted his pace without thinking about it, the way he counted miles on the interstate, the mental odometer he'd developed over 14 years of driving. By his best estimate, he'd covered 1.8, maybe 2 miles. The creek had been with him most of that distance. Macon Creek, running on his right, somewhere below the road's shoulder, audible through the brush as water moving over rocks, steady and indifferent. He'd oriented on it early. As long as the creek was on his right, he was moving parallel to it, which meant he was moving away from the rock bridge and towards something. He just didn't know yet what something was. No farms, no houses, no lights. The canopy was doing the real damage. July in Ohio meant full cover, every tree in heavy leaf, the road tunneling through green that had gone dark gray in the fading light. Out in the open fields above the hollow, there was still a usable hour of dusk. Down here the color had drained out 20 minutes ago, leaving shapes, shadows, the pale stripe of the center line, and the dark strip of the road's edge against whatever was growing on the shoulder. Cole kept to the blacktop edge. The shoulder was soft in places, the kind of soft that announced itself too late if you weren't watching. He'd been trucking since '73, home from Vietnam in June, behind a wheel by September. His uncle had handed him the keys to a Peterbilt 351 at a truck stop outside Dayton and said, "You'll get the hang of it." He'd been getting the hang of it ever since. 14 years of loading docks and weigh stations and the particular mathematics of a schedule, which was the only kind of math that mattered on the road. Miles to destination, hours to delivery window, load weight versus fuel economy. The world reduced to numbers that told you exactly where you stood and exactly what you owed. He'd taken the wrong fork off US 35, somewhere west of Chillicothe. Dusk coming on, the split badly marked, and he'd gone left when he should have gone right. 4 miles of winding 2-lane before that rock bridge appeared, the old stone arch too narrow for the trailer by a good 18 inches. He'd stopped, tried to back up and turn around in a wide spot in the road, misjudged the soft shoulder, felt the rear dual settle into the earth, with the particular sigh of something that was not going to move without heavy equipment and a tow line. The load was produce, melons out of Indiana, going to a distribution center in Columbus. He had until Monday morning before he'd start getting calls. The July heat was doing calculations of its own. He'd set the hazard triangles out as habit, left the keys in the ignition, grabbed the road flare from the emergency kit behind the seat because he didn't know how far he was walking or what the light situation would be. And a man walking an unlit country road after dark was an accident waiting to happen to someone who wasn't him. The flare was almost gone. He kept walking. At 8:47 p.m., the siren cut through the hollow. Cole stopped. It rose from somewhere ahead and to his right, from deep in the trees, where no road or building had any business being. He turned his head, tracking the sound the way you tracked a truck coming up behind you in the dark, and it didn't fit anything he could put a name to. Not a fire alarm, high and urgent. Not an air raid test, which had a slow ceremonial quality he remembered from grade school drills. Not a mill whistle, which he'd heard on enough early morning loading docks to know its rhythm. This had its own rhythm, something deliberate and wrong. It rose, held for a long beat, fell. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the hollow went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a country road after traffic passes. Quiet like a held breath. Even the creek seemed to drop in volume for a moment, the water over rocks going faint, as if Macon Creek had heard what he'd heard and was listening along with him. Cole stood on the dark road with the dying flare in his hand and waited for the sound to come again. It didn't. Old mill equipment. That was his first try at it. Automated, timer-controlled, something left running in a shuttered building nobody'd gotten around to decommissioning. He'd seen that before. Industrial sites that kept making their sounds for years after the workers stopped coming. It wasn't a satisfying explanation. The sound hadn't come from a building. It had come from the trees. He kept walking. What else do you do? The flare went out. Full dark came gradually under the canopy, the way darkness in a room fills in from the corners. He was down to the blacktop edge, the faint pale line of the center stripe, and the sound of the creek on his right. The heat didn't let up. July in Ohio doesn't cool off when the sun goes down. It just gets a different kind of hot, close and wet, the humidity pressing in where the temperature eased off. His shirt was soaked through. His boots felt heavy. He walked by sound and edge and instinct, the same way he navigated a rest stop in a whiteout, slow and deliberate, trusting the ground under his feet. The creek on his right sounded closer now. The road was curving toward it. Then the road dead-ended at a T. Cole stopped, looked both ways. To his right, the road curved toward the sound of the creek. There was a bridge somewhere close in the dark, that direction leading deeper into the hollow. To his left, the road climbed slightly away from the trees, and through the canopy, maybe 300 yards up, the faint, steady flicker of a light. Not a farmhouse glow, a porch light, something purposeful and still. He turned left. The road rose just enough to feel it in his calves. To his right, back toward the creek, something hulked in the darkness between the trees, a shape too large and too angular to be natural, the collapsed silhouette of a building that had stopped being a building a long time ago. The mill. He didn't look at it long. The stone pillars came out of the dark first, 2 of them flanking a gravel drive, old fieldstone, gone mossy at the joints. Then the drive itself, pale gravel catching what little sky glow filtered through the canopy. Then the lodge at the end of it, low and dark, except for the porch light burning steady and orange-yellow against the tree line. Cole walked up the gravel. His boots crunched loud in the silence, every footfall announcing itself, the sound carrying in the dead July air. He climbed 3 wooden porch steps, raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles touched wood. A man stood in the doorway with a flashlight, its beam angled down at the porch boards. He was looking at Cole the way a man looks at something he was expecting but hoping wouldn't come. His expression gave away nothing. Cole lowered his hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment.
The Long Way Round, Scene 1. Earlier that day, Saturday, July 11th, approximately 4:30 p.m. Ironwood Retreat. The heat had been building since noon, and by mid-afternoon, it was the kind of heat that had opinions. Frank Harmon had been working since 7, which in July meant getting the outdoors done before the sun cleared the tree line, and then retreating to the shade and the slower work. He'd walked the fence line at 7:30, checked the horseshoes on every unit door, touched up weathered wood on the Unit 3 porch steps with the can of sealant he'd been carrying from building to building all week. The maintenance at Ironwood never ended. There was always something edging toward neglect, always some small system pushing against the entropy the hollow pressed into everything. He kept up with it because the alternative was letting the place go, and letting the place go was not something he intended to do. By 2 o'clock, he'd moved to the lodge porch with the shade and his water jug and the slow work of replacing the screen on the storm door, which had been pulling loose at the corner since April, and which he'd been meaning to address since April. He worked without hurrying. The hollow was quiet. The creek was audible from the porch, Nakin Creek running low over the rock bed below the east fence, and even its sound had slowed in the heat, the usual bright chatter of water over stone gone sluggish and indolent. He noticed that the way he noticed most things at Ironwood, filed it, didn't yet understand it, moved on. The weekend had been slow. 1 unit occupied through Thursday, a couple from Columbus who'd left Friday morning without much conversation. Since then he'd had the compound to himself, which in 9 years he'd learned to read as a calm that was either genuine or deceptive, and he'd also learned he couldn't always tell which. He was on the porch with his water jug at 4:30 when the car came down the drive. Ohio plates, a sensible sedan in a neutral color, the kind of car chosen for practicality and maintained out of mild indifference. A woman got out moving like someone who had been sitting in a car, working up courage for longer than the drive warranted. She stood beside the car door for a moment before she closed it, and in that moment, Frank watched her look at the tree line before she looked at the lodge. Not the tree line on the left, toward the road. The tree line to the east, toward the creek and the deeper hollow. Frank set down his water jug. She was somewhere in her 50s, sturdy and sensible in the way her car was sensible, silver-streaked hair pinned back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She carried a spiral notebook at her side, already in her hand, and she was looking at the east tree line with an expression that was not fear exactly. Recognition, more like. The face of someone confirming something they'd suspected. He came down the porch steps to meet her. "Help you?" he said. She turned from the tree line, took him in the same way he was taking her in, quick and professional, the practiced assessment of someone whose job involved sizing people up across a counter. "I was hoping you had a room," she said. "Unit, whatever you call them. I've got several available. You have a reservation?" "No." A small pause. "I was driving, ended up here." Frank looked past her at the drive, at the road beyond the stone pillars. "You come in on Old Mill Road?" "Yes. Where were you headed?" She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't heading anywhere specific." "People usually are," Frank said. A beat. The creek ticked on quietly below the fence line. The heat pressed down. "Maybe I was heading here," she said, and didn't know it until I turned in. Frank looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and led her up to the lodge to get her registered. Her name was Dorothy Reeves. "Dot," she said, before he'd asked. She was the deputy clerk of records for Wawasset County, had been for 22 years, was 14 months from retirement and her pension. She gave him these facts the way she might hand over documents, necessary, orderly, nothing extraneous. She paid cash for 2 nights, counted it from an envelope in her purse without being asked, and when he handed her the key to Unit 4, she wrote the unit number in her notebook before she'd looked at the key twice. He walked her over to Unit 4, east side of the compound, second unit from the north end. Log construction, small porch with a rocking chair, the iron horseshoe hanging on its nail above the door frame on the exterior, and a second one on the nail above the frame interior, both facing up, both in place. "The horseshoes," Frank said. He said this part the same way every time, careful and level. Above every door, interior and exterior. They stay where they are. If for any reason one comes down, you hang it back up before you do anything else. Nails already there. Dot was writing in her notebook. "Both of them. Both of them. Any particular reason?" "This place has its own way of doing things," Frank said. "Been here since it was built. The horseshoes are part of how it stays standing." She looked up from the notebook, looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. He returned the look without elaborating. "The siren," he continued. "You'll hear it tonight around 8:47. Maybe sooner. It comes from the old mill site, deeper in the hollow. Goes off every night, has for years. Don't let it startle you." He let a beat pass. "After it sounds, you stay inside. Don't go out alone after dark." She wrote that down too. Exact words, it looked like. "What if I need something from the lodge?" "Knock on my door," Frank said. "I'm in the back unit of the lodge. Knock loud, I'll hear you." He looked at the notebook. "If there's something wrong in the night, or something that doesn't make sense, you come to me before you do anything else." Dot held his eyes for a moment. "You say that like something specific might happen." "I say it the same way to everyone who stays here," Frank said. Which was true. Gets quiet at night in the hollow. Some people find it harder to sleep than they expect. He left her to get settled and walked back to the lodge porch, where he picked up his water jug and sat down in the rocker and watched the light on the east fence line. Something was off with the creek smell. He'd been clocking it since noon, a faint note underneath the usual cold water and rot smell of Knackin Creek in midsummer. Something he didn't have a word for yet. Older, like the smell of a room that's been closed for a long time, which shouldn't be possible for a running creek in open country. But the hollow had its own relationship with what was possible. He sat with it, He'd learned over 9 years that the Hollow gave him information before it gave him understanding, and the discipline was in not reaching for understanding prematurely. The afternoon moved. Shadows stretched east. Dot's light came on in Unit 4, and the small rectangle of her window glowed against the darkening tree line. He could see her shadow moving inside, getting settled, and then the shadow settling at the small table, the notebook open in front of her. He was sure. She'd been carrying something for a long time. He could see it in the way she'd looked at the east tree line, in the measured way she'd answered his questions, in the flat, professional competence she wore the way some people wore armor. Not the armor of someone who was afraid, the armor of someone who had made themselves not afraid by being very, very organized about things that should have frightened them. It can only use what you give it. He'd need to say that to her, and soon. Whether it would matter was a different question. At 8:45, he stood up from the rocker and set down his water jug. At 8:47, the siren came. It rose from the hollow the way it always did, that long, climbing note that had nothing of machinery in it once you'd heard it enough times to stop explaining it as machinery. Frank stood on the porch and counted it out of habit. 32 seconds. It fell, and the hollow went still in that particular way. It went still after the siren, as if the sound had drawn something to attention. He waited. Silence. He looked out at the compound. Unit 4 lit, Dot's shadow still at the table. 5 other units dark, unlocked, standing ready. An hour passed. Frank watched the drive. He didn't know yet that he was watching for anyone. He just felt the watching, the particular sense the hollow sometimes gave him that something was in motion, moving toward the stone pillars. Then boots on the gravel drive. He was already inside, reaching for his flashlight, when the footsteps reached the porch steps. He had the door open before the knock came, and he stood in the doorway, looking at a man who was lean and road-worn and sweating in the July heat, holding a burned-out road flare at his side, no vehicle visible anywhere behind him. The man's eyes adjusted to the porch light, took in the lodge, the compound, the dark drive behind him. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who'd been running calculations and had just come up short by exactly the amount he'd hoped he wouldn't. "Help you?" Frank said. "My truck's stuck back up the road," the man said. "At that rock bridge. I need a phone." Frank looked past him at the empty drive, at the stone pillars and the dark road beyond them, at the direction the man had come from, which was the hollow. The man's left forearm carried a faded tattoo, a unit designation worn to near illegibility by years and sun. He was holding himself very still in the way of someone for whom stillness was an effort rather than a default. "Come inside," Frank said. He stepped back from the door. The man came in out of the July dark, and Frank closed the door behind him. Through the window, he could see Unit 4, Dot's light still burning, her shadow at the table, unaware that the second guest had just arrived. Frank set the flashlight down on the counter and went to put the coffee on. The Long Way Round, Scene 2, Saturday, July 11th, 9:30 p.m. Lodge interior. The number Frank had written down for him rang 4 times and connected to an answering service. Cole listened to the recorded message, which informed him in a cheerful, unhurried voice that Wawasek County Towing was closed on Sundays and would resume normal business hours Monday at 7 a.m. He could leave a message. Someone would return his call first thing. He left the message, gave his name, the road, the approximate location in relation to Rockbridge, the make and model and the weight class. He kept his voice even. He thanked the recording and hung up. He stood at the counter with his hand on the phone for a moment. Monday at 7. He pulled the delivery paperwork from his shirt pocket and unfolded it on the counter. Columbus Distribution Center, Monday arrival window, noon to 4 p.m. His load was produce, Indiana melons, sitting in the trailer right now in the July heat, which didn't care about towing schedules or delivery windows. He did the math without wanting to. By Monday morning, depending on how the temperature ran overnight and through Sunday, he was looking at partial spoilage minimum. The distribution center would dock him for the lost weight. He'd lose the delivery bonus. The towing bill would run him $200, maybe $250 if they needed specialized equipment for the soft shoulder. which they probably would. That was maybe 400 total off the top, plus whatever the spoilage penalty worked out to. Should have stayed on US 35. He folded the paperwork and put it back in his pocket. The numbers didn't change by looking at them. Frank Harmon was at the far end of the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs with the unhurried competence of a man who'd made coffee in this kitchen 10,000 times. The lodge was modest. A main room with a counter along one wall, and a sitting area with 2 chairs and a low table, a door at the back that presumably led to Frank's quarters, a window looking out at the compound. The porch light was visible through the window, a yellow circle on the dark drive. Frank set one of the mugs on the counter near Cole without being asked. Cole picked it up. It was good coffee, stronger than he expected, and he held the mug in both hands without drinking and watched the window. His eyes had been going to the window at regular intervals since he'd come inside. The drive, the stone pillars, the dark road beyond. He was aware of doing it. He couldn't fully stop. Tow companies closed until Monday, Cole said. I expected that, Frank said. You have a lot of people break down on Rockbridge Road? Old Mill Road, Frank said. He turned and leaned against the counter, facing Cole with his coffee. No, not many. Rockbridge is the end of it. Most people who drive it know where they're going. I didn't know where I was going, Cole said. Wrong fork off 35. Frank nodded. He had the quality of a man who listened more than he talked, which Cole had always respected in theory and found mildly aggravating in practice. He liked a man who'd tell you what he knew. This one was deciding what to tell him, and Cole could see him deciding. I've got a unit you can have for the night, Frank said. 2, if you need them. Tow company'll get to you Monday morning. You can be back on the road Monday afternoon. Cole was already doing the time calculation. Load compromised, delivery window missed, 2 days here. It wasn't good. It was better than sleeping in the truck cab in the July heat, which was the alternative. How much? Cole said. $20 a night. I'll take it. He drank the coffee. What was that siren? When I was walking, must have been 8:40, 8:45. 8:47, Frank said. Old mill equipment, automated, goes off every night. Cole looked at him. Sounded like it came from the middle of the woods. Old mill's in the middle of the woods, Frank said. Been shuttered since '52. The siren still runs. Cole held the coffee mug and considered this. It was not a satisfying explanation, and Frank's face said he knew it wasn't a satisfying explanation, and was offering it anyway. What shut it down? Cole said. A beat. Fire, Frank said. 52. Main floor. 14 workers. Investigation ruled it electrical. Mill never reopened. Cole nodded. He didn't push it further, because the expression on Frank's face had shifted in a way that told him pushing it further was not going to get him more information, and because the coffee was good, and he was out of the July heat, and those were the relevant facts right now. He heard the screen door and turned. A woman came in from the porch, sensible shoes on the plank floor, a spiral notebook open in her hand. 50-something, reading glasses on a chain, the look of someone interrupted in the middle of doing something she considered important. She stopped when she saw Cole, and Cole saw her eyes go to his hands first, which were wrapped around the coffee mug, then to his face. Didn't know you had another guest, she said to Frank. Just came in, Frank said. Dorothy Reeves, Unit 4. Cole Decker, coming in for Unit 6. Cole's truck broke down on the road. Truck stuck, Cole said. Not broken down. It was a distinction that mattered, though he couldn't have explained well to a non-trucker why. Dot, she said. She didn't offer her hand, but her expression was friendly enough. She was looking at his hands again, he realized, the way they were moving against the coffee mug, even while he held it, working the ceramic surface. You drove in? Cole asked her. This afternoon. She glanced at Frank. I just came over for a glass of water, if that's all right. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting anything, Frank said, and got her a glass. She stood at the counter and drank it. Cole watched her write something in the notebook while she did it, a line or two, without putting the glass down. Her eyes moved around the room in the systematic way of someone who was cataloguing rather than looking, taking inventory of the lodge. The siren, she said to Frank. 8:47. You explained what it is. It wasn't quite a question. Old mill equipment, Frank said. He was watching her with that settled, assessing quality, the look of a man noting something for later reference. You wrote it down, Cole said. She looked at him. When he told you, Cole said. You wrote it down in the notebook. I write things down, Dot said simply. It helps me organize. Cole looked at his coffee. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that a person who wrote down everything that happened to her was either very organized or very afraid, and he wasn't certain yet which one this was. She finished her water, said goodnight to both of them, and went back out to the compound. Frank watched the window until her unit door closed behind her. The tow company leaves a message form, Frank said to Cole. If you want to get ahead of it tonight, I've got the number for their dispatcher too, for Monday morning. Cole told him he'd taken care of the message already. Frank nodded, finished his coffee, and led him out to Unit 6. West side of the compound, middle unit. Small porch with a rocking chair, the chair angled toward the compound, rather than the tree line. Log construction, tight and well-maintained, no gaps in the chinked walls. Inside, a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a kitchenette alcove along the back wall, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, a window facing the compound, a window facing west toward the tree line. Frank stopped at the door and took the horseshoe down from the nail above the interior frame. You saw these on the way in, Frank said, on all the units. He turned it over in his hands once and passed it to Cole. Interior and exterior, both stay up. The nail's already there if one comes down. You hang it back up, facing up, before anything else. Cole turned the horseshoe over in his hands the way Frank had. Old iron, rough finished, the kind of thing you'd find in a barn, heavy for its size. He looked at it for a moment with an expression Frank couldn't read entirely, then looked up at the nail above the door frame. Both of them, Cole said. Both of them. Cole hung the horseshoe back on its nail. Frank told him the rest of it. Stay inside after the siren, which had already sounded tonight. So tonight that was already the situation. Don't go out alone after dark. If something felt wrong, come to the lodge before doing anything else. Cole listened with the focused attention of a man accustomed to being briefed, taking it in without interruption, without questions. When Frank finished, Cole said, understood. Clean and simple. Frank looked at him. The moving, he said. Cole looked back. You haven't been still since you came in the door, Frank said. Not completely still. You know that about yourself. Cole was quiet for a moment. His right thumb was working the edge of his belt without him apparently being aware of it. I've been driving a long time, he said. You get used to motion. The Hollow's patient, Frank said. He kept his voice level. Whatever you're used to managing by keeping in motion, it'll wait for you to stop. That's what tonight is. You stop. You hold the iron. You don't let the stillness push you out that door. He nodded at the door behind him. If the stillness gets bad enough that you think you need air, you come knock on my door first. Cole looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man taking a measure. You say this to all your guests? The parts that apply, Frank said. Something moved in Cole's face, a small acknowledgement, almost rueful. Then he nodded. I'll stay put. Frank left him there, walked back along the front of the units, checking the compound from habit, the way he always did on his last rounds of the night. Unit 4, Dot's light warm in the window, her shadow moving at the table. Unit 6, dark behind him, quiet. He stopped at Unit 6's door, reached up and put his hand on the horseshoe above the frame. He stood there. The iron was warm. Not summer heat warm, not the warmth of a metal object that had been in a closed building on a July day. Wrong warm. The warmth of something active rather than something stored. The warmth of iron that was doing something. Frank stood in the dark compound with his hand on the horseshoe for a long moment. He could hear the creek on the east side of the fence, running its low midsummer course over the rock bed. He could see Dot's light in Unit 4. Her shadow still moving. He could hear nothing from Unit 6 behind him. He took his hand off the iron. He walked back to the lodge and went inside to his quarters. He lay down on the narrow bed in his clothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to Nacken Creek running on the other side of the fence line. Sleep was a long time coming. The Long Way Round, Scene 3. Saturday, July 11th, 10:30 p.m. through 3:22 a.m. The heat did not break at night in July in southern Ohio. It only changed character, went from the direct press of sunlight to something more ambient, closer to the skin, the kind of heat that made you aware of your own body in a way that was difficult to ignore. Unit 4's window unit ran on its lower setting and did the best it could, which wasn't quite enough. Dot sat at the small table near the window with her notebook open in front of her and wrote. She had been writing since shortly after Frank showed her to the unit, stopping only for her glass of water in the lodge and the brief, awkward introduction to the trucker, Cole. Something about being here, something about the weight of the hollow around her and the way Frank had listened to her partial answers with those careful eyes, had loosened something she had kept very tightly organized for a long time. The Holt family had lived in her private filing system for 15 years. They had not been on paper in that time, not her paper. She'd kept them out of every official document, every public record she had the authority to touch. Raymond and Louise. Their boy David, 16 that summer, already taller than his father. Their daughter Carol, 13, her first summer in braces. Dot wrote their names at the top of a fresh page and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. She worked chronologically, the way she'd been taught, the way the job demanded. Date, source, finding, disposition. July 1972. Raymond Holt, inquiry regarding property parcels adjacent to Old Mill Road in Grindstone Hollow, Wawasset County. She wrote what he had asked for. She wrote what she had found when she'd pulled the adjacent records, the parcel irregularities, the gaps in the deed chain going back to the 1950s, the 2 transfers that didn't match their stated consideration amounts. Red flags she'd recognized on a Wednesday afternoon and quietly refiled. She wrote, I said nothing. I answered his surface questions and let him leave. Then she turned to the Aaron Bledsoe inquiry, March of this year, and wrote that down too. A man asking about the old mill property. She had known where that road went. She had sent him up it anyway, with just enough information to make him curious, and not enough to make him careful. 2 items in her private record, 15 years apart. Both times she had seen something irregular, recognized it, and filed it where it would not be found. She underlined the date on the Bledsoe entry and looked at it for a while. The filing cabinet sound came at 11 p.m. She stopped writing. It came from behind the wall to her left, the wall she shared with the bathroom. And it was unmistakable, the way certain sounds are unmistakable, because they are so specific, so mechanical, so precisely what they are that you cannot mistake them for anything else. A metal drawer on its tracks, the sound of it running out to full extension, the small jolt as it reached the end of the guide rail, the soft, hollow thud of it settling open. She sat very still. 2 seconds, 3, 5. Nothing else. The window unit ran. Outside, through the screens, the hollow breathed. Leaves in a tree somewhere doing something that wasn't quite wind. She told herself, buildings settle, especially old ones, and this was not an old building exactly, but the framework was timber, and timber moved in heat. It expanded and contracted. She had a neighbor on Pickaway Street whose house talked to itself all summer long, pops and ticks, an occasional groaning that had startled her the first time she heard it. Perfectly normal. She turned back to her notebook and kept writing. The second sound came at 11:40. This one was cleaner. Not a building settling, not a timber contracting. The drawer again, running out on its tracks with a sound so precise she could hear the individual rollers, and then the shuffle of papers inside it, a sound she knew from 22 years of working with physical files, the specific whisper of documents being moved. Then the soft push of the drawer running closed. Dot set down her pen. She lifted her glasses and settled them on the bridge of her nose and looked at the wall. Bare log, chinked, the same construction as the rest of the unit. No furniture on that side of the room. The bathroom door was open, and she could see in the vanity and the toilet and the edge of the tub, all of it empty, all of it ordinary. She got up and checked the bathroom, checked behind the door, checked the tub. She came back out and stood in the middle of the unit and listened. Nothing. The window unit, the hollow. She went to the door. The horseshoe was on its nail above the frame, right where she had hung it when Frank showed her the protocol. She reached up, and unhooked it from the nail and brought it to the table with her. Set it in her lap. The iron was cool against her thighs through the fabric of her slacks, reassuringly ordinary. She picked up her pen. The sound didn't come again that night. She was still at the table at 2 a.m, writing by lamplight, the horseshoe in her lap, every light in the unit burning. The notebook was 12 pages denser than it had been when she arrived. She had written every name, every date, everything she had filed away and left buried. It was not a confession document, not exactly. It was what it had always been, what she always made when she processed something difficult. A record, a proper account, with dates and sources and findings, and her own notations in the margin where the record was incomplete. She told herself she felt better for it. She was not entirely sure that was true. Cole had managed about 20 minutes flat on the bed before the lying still became something his body simply refused. It wasn't insomnia. He knew insomnia, had made its acquaintance in a serious way about 14 years ago, and insomnia had a particular quality, a greyness, an inability to turn the mind down. This was different. This was the same thing that made him take the long route when the short route was available, the same thing that had him filling coffee cups in truck stop diners and pacing the length of the rig when he pulled over for the federally mandated rest, and every cell in his body was filing a formal objection. He got up, did a circuit of the small unit. Bathroom, kitchenette, back to the bed. 14 steps total, which told him nothing useful. He sat on the edge of the bed, got up again. He'd cracked the window earlier for air, closed it because the sounds from the hollow were too close, too specific, the kind of sounds that made him catalogue them automatically, the way you catalogued sounds in country where things could happen. The closing of the window helped with that, but didn't help with the heat. He sat on the bed and did what Frank had told him and held the horseshoe and thought about the load sitting out on Rock Bridge Road in the July heat. A full trailer of Indiana melons, and melons did not manage heat. Not in July, not sitting still on a hollow road with no airflow and no refrigeration. He was worrying about the load. He was also using the load as something to think about besides the room. Columbus was 100 miles northeast. He had run that route 40 times at least, could sketch the turns from memory, knew every fuel stop and way station. On a normal Monday morning, he would be back on the road by 6, maybe 6:30, and in Columbus by mid-morning with time to spare for the delivery window and a full afternoon to deadhead west or pick up something out of the Columbus terminal going south or east. 14 years of running his own schedule, and he had the logistics of it in his blood. Give him a map and a starting point, and he could calculate 3 possible routes before you finished the sentence. He was in a small unit in a place called Grindstone Hollow, and he had no vehicle and no route and no delivery window, and the stillness was a physical thing pressing down on him from the ceiling. The radio static started around midnight. It was faint, barely there, intermittent, the kind of interference you'd chalk up to bad wiring or something in the walls, without a second thought, if you had not spent 3 years in Southeast Asia with your ear tuned to the specific texture of a PRC-25 field radio. Cole heard it and knew it, and was off the bed and at the wall behind the headboard before he had processed knowing it. He put his ear against the plaster. The static was there, just inside audibility, rising and falling in the irregular pattern of long-range atmospheric interference. Military radio frequencies. He knew that sound the way he knew his own heartbeat. He had fallen asleep to it in the Mekong Delta in 1970, because falling asleep in the field meant tuning out every sound except the ones that meant incoming. And the radio static had become part of the background, the same way the creek noise outside was part of the background now. He checked the window. Nothing in the dark outside, the hollow, the fence line, the shapes of the other units in the dark. He went back to the bed and sat down and held the horseshoe in both hands and looked at the wall. The static faded after 20 minutes. Not all at once, gradually, the way an actual radio did when the atmospheric conditions shifted. Cole sat on the edge of the bed and listened to it go and waited for it to come back. It didn't come back. He lay down eventually, boots still on, staring at the ceiling. He did not sleep. Frank had been in bed for 30 minutes when the 8:47 siren sounded, which meant he was awake for it, which was almost always the case. 23 years of living beside this hollow, 9 of them keeping the watch alone, and the siren had become as calibrated in his body as the alarm clock he rarely needed anymore. He lay in the dark and counted it out of habit, the way his father had taught him. 1 count for each second. The siren rose, held, fell. 30 seconds flat. He exhaled. He listened to the hollow settle back into its nighttime silence. Heard nothing that concerned him. The creek on the far side of the fence line, running its course. The small mechanical complaints of the unit's window units. Through the wall, faint, the sound of Dot moving in Unit 4, still up and writing, which he had expected. He closed his eyes. He was not asleep when the second siren came at 3:22. He was out of bed before it finished. Standing in the middle of his quarters in the dark in his boots and trousers, the rebar in his right hand, without any memory of picking it up. He counted. 31 seconds, matching the first one's duration within a single count. Not a mechanical malfunction, not a stuttering relay, a repetition. The siren that rose and fell once each night at 8:47 had risen and fallen twice tonight, and the second time was 3:22 in the morning. In 9 years of keeping this watch, Frank had never heard the siren twice in one night. He stood in the dark and finished counting and waited for a third. Nothing. The hollow was quiet in the way the hollow was always quiet after the siren, the specific held-breath quality of it, every living thing in the tree line going still and small. Frank waited another 60 seconds to be certain. Then he moved. He did the full compound in 12 minutes, every unit, every threshold, every horseshoe checked by the flashlight and by touch. Unit 1 through Unit 5 on the left side of the lane, Unit 6 through Unit 10 on the right. He checked Dot's horseshoe first, because hers was the one he was most concerned about. It was cool. Good. He moved through the unoccupied units methodically, looking for nothing and finding nothing. He saved Unit 6 for last. He put his hand on the horseshoe above Cole's door. The warmth was immediate and distinct. Not the ambient warmth of July air on a metal surface. The iron had absorbed July air for 3 years, and he knew exactly what it felt like at 80 degrees ambient temperature. This was different, warmer than it had been earlier. He pressed his palm flat against the curve of the horseshoe and held it there and felt the wrongness of it, the too warmness, the iron doing something iron should not do on its own. Through the window, the gap in Cole's curtains showed no movement inside. The unit was still. Frank stood with his hand on the warm iron and listened to the compound around him. Then he listened to the creek. Nakin Creek ran on the right side of Old Mill Road, coming from Rock Bridge toward Maple Grove Road, and in the hollow it was audible on still nights from the fence line, a steady low sound that Frank had stopped consciously hearing years ago, the way you stopped hearing your own refrigerator. It was part of the background, part of the texture of the place. It was running fast, not flood fast, not storm runoff fast, but wrong fast, moving with an urgency that had nothing to do with any rainfall he could account for. July was dry. The creek should be at its summer minimum, slow and shallow over the rocks. It was not. It moved in the dark beyond the fence line with a sound that was almost purposeful, almost like something traveling, like the creek itself was trying to get somewhere and not getting there fast enough. Frank stood at the fence line for a while and listened to it. Then he walked back to the lodge and sat down on the front steps. The rebar was cool across his knees. His father had handled this piece of iron for 30 years before him, and whatever his father had worked into it, the treatments and the words and the particular kind of attention that had occupied the last 15 years of his father's life, it was still present in the metal. Frank could feel it when the hollow was active, the faint resonance in the iron, a hum so low it was more feeling than sound, like standing next to a generator when the generator was running correctly. Tonight, it was quiet. Not no hum, but a normal hum, the steady background awareness of a tool doing its passive work, which should have been reassuring. It wasn't, entirely. He sat on the porch steps in the July dark and listened to the creek run wrong and watched the warm square of light through Unit 4's curtain, where Dot was still writing at 2 in the morning. organizing 15 years of guilt into something she could label and cross-reference, doing the only thing she knew how to do with the unbearable, filing it. The first grey light of dawn was 2 hours away. Frank sat and waited for it. The Long Way Round, Scene 4. Sunday, July 12th. Morning, approximately 8 a.m. Frank had eggs on the range by 7:30 and coffee done by 7:45, and the smell of it moved through the lodge and into the morning air outside the way. Good coffee smells always moved, insistent and particular, the kind of thing that made people come toward it without quite deciding to. Dot was already at the table when he started the eggs. She had her notebook open and her reading glasses on and her second cup in front of her, and she looked like a woman who had not slept more than 2 hours, which Frank suspected was true. She did not look shaken exactly. She looked organized. She had reorganized herself in the night, filed the shaken parts somewhere more manageable, and here she was with her notebook and her coffee and her particular posture of a woman who arrived early to appointments. Cole came in from outside at 7:55, where he had apparently been walking the perimeter of the compound since before the coffee was ready. He was on his second circuit when Frank spotted him through the window. He came in when the coffee was done and stood at the counter and did not sit down until Frank put a plate in front of him. And even then, he sat the way certain men sit when they have reluctantly agreed to sit, upright and ready to stand again. Frank brought his own plate to the table and listened. Dot described the filing cabinet sound with the precision of a woman who had spent 22 years writing accurate reports. The time of the first occurrence, the time of the second, the specific quality of the sound, the drawer on its tracks, the thud of full extension. She distinguished it clearly from building noise, from the HVAC, from anything she could assign a rational cause to. She said she'd unhooked the horseshoe and kept it in her lap, and the sound hadn't come a third time. Frank said, "Good, that was the right instinct." Dot said, "It's not really an instinct, it's just that you told me what the iron was for." She wasn't dismissing the experience. She was categorizing it, Frank thought. She was deciding which file to put it in, and the file she was choosing was "This actually happened," and she had chosen it with the same deliberate precision she'd used to describe the sound itself. That was good. Guests who rationalized were harder to help. Cole said he'd had a rough night. Bad dreams. Some kind of electrical interference in the walls, probably old wiring. He said this looking at the surface of his coffee rather than at either of them. And it was not quite lying, Frank knew. It was the same thing Dot had been doing for 15 years, filing the uncomfortable part somewhere it didn't have to be examined directly. Frank let it go for the moment. Dot stepped outside with her coffee after breakfast, and Frank moved to the counter to refill his cup and spoke to Cole quietly. "The moving," he said. "Pacing the compound before 8 in the morning. That's how you manage it, whatever it is you're carrying." Cole looked at him, not hostile. Assessing, the way men assess when they're trying to decide whether a person is worth talking to or whether they're about to receive something they don't want. "I sleep better moving," Cole said. "The Hollow's patient," Frank said. "Whatever you've been out running, it doesn't get tired. It'll wait for you to stop." "I've been stopping every night for 14 years, Cole said. "Motels, truck stops, rest areas off the highway." "You've been pausing," Frank said. "That's different." Cole said nothing for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow rotation, the way a man handles something without deciding to put it down. "What do you want me to do about it?" he said. "Tonight," Frank said, "you stay inside. You sit on the bed. You hold the iron. You do not let the stillness push you out the door." "And that works," Frank said. "It works better than the alternative." Cole looked at him with those road-worn eyes, the permanent squint of a man who had spent 14 years looking at the far end of a windshield, and Frank could see him taking the instructions apart and reassembling them the way a man who has followed orders before does, evaluating which ones matter and which ones are form. He seemed to arrive at a conclusion he didn't announce. Later, while Cole was at the window with the tow company's number, Frank sat next to Dot and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear him. "What you've been carrying," Frank said. The Hollow knows the weight of it, not the details necessarily. The weight. It can feel 15 years of not doing something the same way. It can feel 15 years of doing something wrong. Dot looked at him over her reading glasses. That's not a very comforting thought. No, Frank said, but it's useful. What's useful to know is that it can only use what you give it. Dot looked at him for another moment. Then she opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote down what he had just said. Word for word, the way she wrote everything, clean and legible and organized. Frank watched her write it. He felt the cold thread of worry move through him before he could stop it. Not alarm, not panic, just the particular chill of a man who has seen enough to recognize a shape when it appears. The notebook was going to be a problem. She had brought it everywhere since she arrived. It was in her hand before she reached the table in the morning. She'd had it in her lap last night when she unhooked the horseshoe, and it kept her company until 2 in the morning, and she'd probably have slept with it beside her if she'd slept at all. If something happened tonight and she needed her notebook, she would go back to the unit for it, whatever the circumstance, whatever the instruction he gave her. She would not be able to help herself. The notebook was her processing system, the way she stayed in control of a situation, and losing access to it would be more frightening to her than almost anything he could name. The Hollow had been here for a very long time. It knew how to find what a person couldn't do without. From the window, Cole said, "Nobody's picking up." He set the receiver down with a care that cost him something. Monday morning. That's what the message says. Someone will return the call Monday morning. He stood at the window with his hands on the sill and looked out at the drive and the road beyond the stone pillars. The road he had walked in the dark, on foot. Somewhere up that road, his rig was sitting in the July heat with 12 pallets of canned goods in the trailer, and a delivery window in Columbus that was now a problem, and a dispatch office that had definitely called someone by now. Dot came and stood beside him for a moment, looking at the same road. 2 people looking at the same thing for entirely different reasons. Frank stood at the kitchen side of the counter and watched them. He was running calculations he didn't like the shape of. 2 guests, 2 separate kinds of damage, 2 creatures already making their first sounds in the night. The second siren, the warm horseshoe, the creek running wrong. 9 years of keeping this watch. He had learned to read the arithmetic of a weekend, to know by Saturday night whether a guest was going to make it through to Monday and drive away. He had been wrong before, in the early years, when his father's training was still fresh enough to be confidence-giving, and he had not yet accumulated enough failures to know what the failures felt like at the front end. He knew what they felt like now. Frank turned back to the range and poured the last of the coffee. The Long Way Round, Scene 5. Sunday, July 12th, afternoon, approximately 2 p.m. The heat came back full after breakfast and kept building. By noon, the Hollow was a different kind of miserable than July in a city, which at least offered concrete and glass to hold and release and move the heat around. Here the tree canopy trapped it, held it at ground level, concentrated it the way a greenhouse concentrated it. The shade offering no relief because the air under the canopy was itself hot, heavy and still, laced with the smell of rot and creek water, and something deeper that Dot had noticed on and off since she arrived, and still hadn't filed into a satisfactory category. Frank had suggested they stay inside. Neither of them could manage it. They ended up on the grounds because it was marginally better than the units, the small window units, making the air thicker somehow, less breathable. Cole had been circling the fence line since just after noon, which was exactly the kind of thing Frank had meant about sitting still, and Dot had come out with her notebook and found herself walking alongside him without quite planning to, the way you sometimes fall into step with someone and find it easier to keep walking than to explain why you've stopped. The fence line made a rectangle. Cole had established this on his 3rd circuit and told her the dimensions in strides, which he converted to approximate footage, which Dot found oddly comforting, the precision of it. She made a note. Cole watched her make the note and didn't say anything about it. They talked about small things first, the way people do. His routes. He ran the Midwest mostly, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, sometimes south through Tennessee when the loads took him. He had covered enough miles in 14 years to have crossed the country end to end 11 times, give or take, which was something he had worked out on a long stretch through Kansas once, with nothing to do but count. Dot said she had never been west of Columbus, which was a 2-hour drive she had made exactly 4 times on official county business. Cole looked at her sidelong without comment. She told him about the records office. The job of it, the actual daily texture of property records and deed transfers, and the small irregular dramas of a county's paper history, the estates that turned contentious, and the boundary disputes that went back 3 generations, and the occasional genuine mystery in the deed chain, where something had clearly happened, but the record had been carefully kept from saying what. Cole listened the way a man listens when he is not accustomed to listening, but is making the effort. The thunderstorm had been building all morning without breaking. She had watched it through the lodge window over lunch, the sky above the tree line going the specific greenish-yellow of serious Ohio weather, the kind of sky that smelled like electricity 2 hours before you heard the first thunder. It broke at 2:15. A hard, fast rain that came out of the southwest with a sound like someone had opened a valve. She and Cole were at the far end of the fence line, and they ran for the porch overhang and made it without getting entirely soaked. The rain hammered the gravel of the drive and made a fast, shallow river of it. They stood under the porch eave and watched it come down. Lightning in the tree line to the southwest, then the thunder, close enough to feel in the chest. Dot counted between them. Frank came out and stood in the doorway behind them, and then went back inside. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in 15 minutes. Then the rain stopped, and the temperature climbed back 6 of those degrees in the following 5, and the humidity was worse. The conversation during the rain was a different thing than the conversation before it. Cole said, "How long were you driving before you turned in here?" Dot thought about it. "An hour," she said. "Maybe a little more. I was on Old Mill Road before I knew I'd decided to be there." "I took the wrong fork off 35, Cole said. "At dusk. Dark enough I didn't see the sign until I was committed." He paused. 4 miles in, Rock Bridge, which is where my truck is now." "Did you know something was wrong before the bridge?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He had his forearms on the porch rail, and he was watching the rain taper off. And she saw his right hand move across to his left forearm without any apparent intention, his fingers settling on the faded unit tattoo, the way they might settle on a scar you forgot was there. "I knew the road felt wrong," he said. "The way certain roads feel at dusk when you've been driving since before sunrise. Could have been tired. Could have been the light." "Could have been," Dot said. The rain ran off the eave in a solid sheet, and the hollow steamed slightly as the drops hit the hot ground. She said, "I knew something was wrong with a property inquiry 15 years ago. A family came in asking about parcels near the hollow." She kept her eyes on the rain. "I found irregularities in the surrounding records, the kind of thing that would have told a careful person to look more closely." Cole waited. "I answered their surface questions," she said. Smiled. Sent them on their way. She did not say the rest. She did not have to. Cole was quiet for a while. Then, "Did it go badly for them?" "The father and one of the children," she said. "The mother and the other girl left the county. I never looked up where they went." Another silence. The rain slowed to a spatter and then stopped. The hollow exhaled. Cole said, "I lost a man in country in 1970. Dot waited. "He froze under fire," Cole said. "I got him moving. Sent him toward a position." He stopped. His hand was still on the tattoo. He was looking at the fence line, at the tree line beyond it, at nothing specific. He didn't make it. She could hear what was underneath that. The grammar of what he wasn't saying was clear enough. Not simply that the man had been sent and hadn't made it. Something before that. Some beat of time between the freezing and the sending, where something had happened that Cole had been carrying the weight of for 17 years. She said, "You don't have to." "No," he said. "I know." They stood there. The heat came back around them. What passed between them in the next few minutes was not spoken and could not have been. Two people who had organized their guilt differently, one in notebooks and cross-referenced files, and the careful maintenance of an accurate private record she never showed anyone. One in motion, in rotes and miles, and the forward momentum of a man who had learned that stopping meant having to be somewhere, and somewhere meant the somewhere you'd been trying to leave since 1973. They did not comfort each other, because neither of them knew how to accept comfort, and probably neither had been offered much in a long time. But they were less alone for about 40 minutes under that porch eave than they had been in years. Cole said, "You think staying here is going to fix whatever it is you filed away?" Dot thought about it. "I don't think it's going to fix anything," she said. "I think it's going to collect." A beat. Cole said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." After the storm passed, Dot went back to her unit with her notebook. Cole stayed on the porch, leaning on the rail, drumming his fingers against the wood in an irregular pattern that was not quite a rhythm. Frank came back out and lowered himself into the rocker beside the door. He had his coffee. He didn't offer conversation, and Cole didn't seem to need it. The afternoon heat settled back in around them. Frank said after a while, "You got someone waiting on that load?" "Distribution center in Columbus," Cole said. "They'll have called the dispatcher by now." "That worrying you?" Cole turned it over. "Everything's worrying me," he said, "and none of it's the load." Frank nodded once and drank his coffee. The creek was louder than it had been that morning. Frank could hear it clearly now from the porch, which he should not have been able to in July when the water level was low and the banks absorbed the sound. The hard, fast rain would have added some runoff, but not this much, not enough to account for the volume coming from the far side of the fence line. Nakin Creek in July should be the background murmur of a thing doing its slow work. This was something else. This was water moving like it had somewhere to be. Frank registered it, noted it the way he noted all the dread signals, filed it in the same part of his attention where he kept all the things he was tracking and did not yet fully understand. He did not mention it to Cole. Cole drummed his fingers on the rail and watched the tree line, and the hollow sweltered around them in the long July afternoon. The Long Way Round, Scene 6, Sunday, July 12th, night, 9 p.m. through approximately 1:30 a.m. Frank kept them on the porch as long as he could manage, which was what he always did when he knew the night was going to be bad. Coffee, conversation, the three of them in the porch chairs as the July dark came on in layers. First the color going out of the tree line, then the shapes going soft, then the full dark settling in with the particular weight it had in the hollow, heavier than other darks, carrying more. He talked. He asked Cole about the routes he knew, got him going on the geography of moving freight in the Midwest, and Cole talked about it with the fluency of a man who had arranged his knowledge there and kept it organized and could access it without cost. He asked Dot about the county records, how the deed chain worked, what a typical complicated case looked like. She explained it with the precision that was her natural mode, and Frank listened and asked follow-up questions and let the time run. At 8:47, the siren. Cole's jaw tightened in a way that was almost invisible. Dot's pen was already out, the way it was always out. Frank heard her write the time. He counted the siren's duration without showing he was counting. 30 seconds. It faded. He waited a full minute before speaking, which let both of them hear the silence that followed, the hollow settling back around them. "One," he said. "Just the one." He watched them receive that, watched them want to believe it was reassurance and mostly succeed. He refilled both their cups and set the carafe on the rail and turned his chair so he could see both of them directly. "Tonight," he said, and something in his voice moved them both to look at him, the specific register of a man who is done being oblique. "I've told you some of this already. Now I'm telling you without the hedging." He looked at Dot. "Whatever you need from your unit, you leave it until morning. You do not go back there alone tonight. Whatever it is, if you think you've left something behind, you wait. Whatever it is, it can wait." Dot looked at her notebook, which was in her lap. She had it with her. If it's not in your hands when you go to bed, Frank said, leave it. She looked up at him. Her expression was the particular expression of a woman who was receiving information she had already halfway understood and was trying to decide whether she would be able to act on it. He turned to Cole. The stillness is going to push you. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You sit on the bed, you hold the iron, you keep the lights on. The door stays closed. Cole said, and if I hear it again? You hold the iron and you wait, Frank said. You do not go to the window. You do not go to the door. You sit on the bed and you wait for daylight. Cole looked at him with that road-worn squint. Has that worked before? Frank said, yes, which was true. He did not say, not always, and not for everyone, because that was also true, and Cole would hear the part he didn't say regardless. They went to their units around midnight. Dot sat at the small table in Unit 4 with her notebook open to a fresh page and her pen uncapped and the horseshoe in the pocket of her housecoat where she could feel the weight of it against her hip. She wrote the names at the top of the page with clean, deliberate handwriting, the way she would have written them in an official document if she had ever allowed them into an official document, the way they deserved to be written. Raymond Holt, she wrote. Louise Holt. David Holt, age 16, summer 1972. Carol Holt, age 13. She had kept them out of every record she had authority over. She had not mentioned them in the missing persons processing that her office had been a peripheral part of, had answered the sheriff's deputy's questions with a careful surface accuracy that technically contained no lies and told him nothing useful. She had photocopied certain things and kept the copies in a folder at home and told herself that was enough. That was her way of acknowledging that having the record, even privately, was better than not having it. It wasn't enough. She knew that. She had known it in a quiet back file of her brain for 15 years, the same place she had filed the knowledge that sending Aaron Bledsoe up Old Mill Road 3 months ago was also not enough, was also another iteration of the same choice. She wrote their names and wrote the date and wrote what she knew in the format she had used for 22 years. Date, source, finding, disposition. Disposition, withheld. The filing cabinet sound began at 12:30. Both drawers this time. First one, then the other, in sequence, the mechanical slide and soft thud of each reaching full extension. Then, the unmistakable sound of papers being moved, the specific whisper of documents in a drawer being sorted, being looked through, being found. Dot sat very still with her pen in her hand. The sound of the drawers sliding closed again. Then silence. She looked at the door of the unit. The horseshoe was on the nail above it, where Frank had shown her to hang it on the first night, not in her pocket. She had moved it, taken it down to keep it close while she slept, and hadn't moved it back this evening. The first document appeared under the door. It pushed through the gap at the bottom with the soft whisper of paper on wood, a 1/4 inch at a time, the way paper comes through a mail slot, and settled on the floor with a small flat sound. She could see it from where she sat, an 8.5 by 11 sheet, white, face down. She did not get up immediately. Another document, the same soft whisper, the same 1/4 inch patience. Then a third. She got up. She picked up the horseshoe from the nail above the door and put it in her pocket, and then she picked up the documents from the floor. She recognized all 3. The original property inquiry from July 1972, Raymond Holt's handwriting in the spaces she had watched him fill in while she smiled at him from behind the counter and noticed the irregularities in the adjacent parcels. The missing persons report from August 1972, her own notations in the margin from when the deputy had brought it by for cross-referencing, the careful surface-level assistance she had provided. The Bledsoe inquiry form from March of this year, her initials in the processing box. She set them on the table in front of her open notebook. Looked at them. The paper was real. The handwriting was real. She touched the edge of Raymond Holt's 1972 inquiry and felt the faint crinkle of paper that had been stored a long time, the slight brittleness of old document stock. She sat back down. Raymond Holt was standing in the corner of the unit. She did not hear him arrive. He was simply there, between the dresser and the far wall, in the clothes she remembered from that Wednesday in July, the short-sleeved, button-front shirt, the slacks that were slightly too formal for a summer afternoon, a man who had dressed to visit a government office and wanted to be taken seriously. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at her. David stood beside him, taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had underestimated the boy's height at the time, had not looked carefully enough. He wore a t-shirt and jeans, 16 years old. He had his father's posture, the slight forward lean of a person paying close attention. They held the files, one file each, the kind of manila folder she had handled 10,000 times, and they held them out at their sides in a gesture that was not offering and was not demanding and was something else, something that did not have a name in the filing system she had built her adult life around. Patient. That was the word. Their patience was the worst thing about them. Worse than the eyes, which she saw when she finally made herself look directly at them. The eyes that were wrong in a way that she couldn't document, that looked like they went back further than eyes should go. Drawer behind drawer behind drawer in a cabinet with no bottom. They were not angry. They had no rage in them that she could see. They had waited 15 years, and they could wait longer. They were simply present, the way an unresolved record was present. The way something filed incorrectly stayed in the system, findable by anyone who looked in the right place. Dot did not scream. She opened her notebook to the next clean line and picked up her pen. "They were waiting for me," she wrote. The light went out, not gradually, not a flicker, not a power surge, nothing that led to it. Between 1 second and the next, all of it gone. The bedside lamp and the table lamp and the bathroom light she had left burning as well. The unit was completely dark, and in the dark, the only thing Dot knew was the weight of the horseshoe in her pocket and the specific quality of the darkness itself, which was not the ordinary darkness of a room with the lights out. Cole had made it 40 minutes. He counted them, because counting was the one thing he could do from the bed without moving, and counting meant his mind had something to do that wasn't cataloguing the dimensions of the unit, or calculating the distance from the bed to the door, or working out how many steps it was to the window. He sat on the bed with the horseshoe in both hands and counted the minutes on his watch by the light of the bedside lamp. 40 minutes was 823 seconds, and that was a run he had made in his head before, or a similar one. Sitting in a position in the dark and watching time move, because watching time was the only way to make it move. The specific discipline of staying in one place when staying in one place was the last thing available. The radio static began in the walls at 12:45. He felt it before he heard it, or thought he did. A slight charge in the air of the room, the way the air charged before lightning, that atmospheric tightening. Then the sound, the specific texture of it, the frequency, and the intermittent rhythm of a PRC-25, picking up atmospheric noise on a quiet frequency. He knew it. He had known it last night. He kept both hands on the horseshoe and watched the wall where the sound was coming from and did not get up. Danny's face appeared at the window at 1 a.m. Not his whole face. The forehead and the eyes above the sill, the way a person looks when they are standing outside a window that is at chest height and leaning slightly toward the glass. 19 years old. Brown eyes that Cole could see even in the dark outside because they caught the bedside lamp's light through the glass. The face was not wrong the way the Hollow's creatures were usually wrong. No wrongness in the joints or the movement. It was Danny's face with complete fidelity, the exact face Cole had last seen 3 hours before the aid station, the face he had seen without wanting to in the specific geography of 4 in the morning for 17 years. The face at the window had a question in it, not accusation. A question. The particular confusion of someone who has been waiting for an explanation and has not received one. Cole held the horseshoe. He looked at the face at the window and he did not go to it. He did not open the door. He sat on the bed and held the iron and breathed and watched Danny look at him with that question in his 19-year-old eyes, and the radio static in the walls rose and fell, and Cole said nothing. Then Dot's light went out. He saw it through the gap in his curtains, the strip of Unit 4's lit window that had been there since midnight. The warm, specific rectangle of it in the dark compound. It went out. Between 1 second and the next. There and then not. Danny's face disappeared from the window. Cole sat on the bed for 60 seconds. He counted them. 1 to 60, deliberate. The way Frank had said, sit on the bed and hold the iron. Sit and wait. At 60, he was across the compound before he had made a decision to move. The horseshoe still in his right hand. His boots on the gravel. The hot July dark around him. He covered the distance between the units without processing the running. He was at Dot's door, pounding on it with the flat of his hand, calling her name, and the door did not open, and there was no sound from inside. He went for Frank. Frank had the master key on his belt, and he was through the unit door in 9 seconds after Cole came for him, Cole behind him in the doorway with his hand flat against the door frame. Dot was on the floor beside the table, face down, one arm extended, her hand still loosely curled around the pen. The notebook was open beside her. Frank knelt and checked the pulse at her throat, and already knew what he would find there. The documents were on the table. The horseshoe was in her pocket, not above the door. He looked at the notebook. 1 line on the open page, in her clean, precise handwriting. They were waiting for me. He straightened up and stood beside her for a moment. The hollow outside the unit was completely silent. Not the watchful silence of the early night, not the held-breath silence after the siren. Something different. The silence of a room after everyone has left it. Frank listened through the open door to the compound, to the tree line, to the darkness beyond the fence. Knackin Creek was silent. He had stood at the fence line 2 nights ago and heard it running too fast, and all yesterday it had been louder than it should have been, moving with that wrong urgency. Now it was gone. No water sound at all, as if the creek bed itself had been emptied, as if whatever had been driving it had finished and stopped. Frank stood in Unit 4 and listened to the hollow in its silence and understood, in a way that bypassed his thinking and went straight to the bones, that it was satisfied. Cole was in the doorway. Frank turned and looked at him. Cole was looking past him at Dot on the floor, at the notebook, at the 1 line. His face had gone very still, the restlessness completely out of it, which was more frightening than the pacing had been. Frank put his hand on Cole's shoulder. "Come away," he said. The Long Way Round, Scene 7, Monday, July 13th, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. The porch of the main lodge had no light except what leaked through the office window, and Frank had pulled the blind, so there was almost nothing, just the shapes of the rocking chairs, and the dark compound beyond, and the tree line further out, a solid black wall against the less solid black of the sky. No stars. The humidity had closed everything off. Cole sat in the chair nearest the steps. He hadn't moved since Frank guided him here from Unit 4. That was what troubled Frank, the not moving. He'd watched Cole Decker for 2 days, knew his rhythms the way he knew all his guests' rhythms, that careful reading that was the real work of keeping the watch. Cole paced when he thought, stood when he could have sat, stood and then moved again when standing went too long. Even asleep, Frank suspected, Cole turned frequently, worked toward the edge of the bed, looked for an exit. Now he sat with his hands on the arms of the rocking chair, and he did not rock, and he did not fidget, and he stared at the middle distance between the porch and the tree line with an expression that was not quite blank. It was something worse than blank. It was a face where all the restlessness had simply stopped, like a clock that had run down, and the stillness was not peace. Frank had seen faces like that before. He did not like what they meant. He took the other chair and let the silence go for a few minutes. The air pressed down, thick and warm, smelling of the creek's changed water and something else underneath it, something that had no name he'd found yet. An old smell. Pre-language. Cole said without turning his head. She wrote something. Yes, 1 line. Yes. Cole was quiet again. Then, she knew. When she crossed that compound, she knew what she was walking into. Frank considered that. Maybe. She made a decision. Cole's voice was flat, not accusing, just stating the geometry of it. She went in knowing. People do. It's not the same. Cole's jaw tightened slightly, the first movement in several minutes. She chose it. I was standing right there and I let her go, and she chose it. That's not the same as me not being fast enough or not being strong enough, she decided. Frank said nothing. He'd learned over 9 years that sometimes a person needed to work the math themselves, and interrupting that work was its own kind of harm. I've been in rooms with people making that kind of decision before, Cole said. I know what it looks like. I didn't stop her. You did what I told you. You stayed. Cole turned his head then, and Frank saw his eyes in the faint light from the office window. I left when her light went out. She was already gone. I know that. A pause, long enough to fill with the non-sounds of the hollow, not silence exactly, but a suspended quality, everything holding. I always know that after. The weight in those last 2 words landed in the porch and sat there. Frank heard it clearly. This wasn't the first time Cole had been the last man standing. He'd known it before in the broad strokes, the way he knew it about every guest who carried a certain kind of damage. But hearing it said plainly was different. How many times? Frank asked. Cole looked back at the tree line. Enough. Frank didn't push. He reached into the pocket of his work shirt and turned one of the horseshoes over in his hand, feeling the pitted iron, the familiar weight of it. He'd pulled it from the supply in the back of the office an hour ago, while Cole was sitting on the steps not quite crying. A guest who'd made it through a first night sometimes needed more than one piece of iron going into the second. Sometimes the hollow could locate the edge of what one horseshoe protected, and it worked right up against that edge, patient as a river against stone. He wasn't sure it would help. That was the thing he hadn't said and wouldn't say. He'd given Cole good counsel, clean and correct, and Cole was still sitting here in the hot dark at 2 a.m. with that wound-down clock expression on his face. And Dot Reeves was still lying on the floor of Unit 4, waiting for the coroner's van that wouldn't come until morning. Frank had done everything right. So had Cole, mostly. And the hollow had walked through Dot's need to put words to things, had found Cole's need to move, had used them both against themselves in the span of a single weekend. 9 years ago, that kind of speed would have been impossible, he'd thought. She was 70 feet away, Cole said. The math again. The trucker's habit of measuring everything in distances, 70 feet and a locked door. Yes, I could have gone sooner. And you'd be in there with her. Cole's hands tightened on the chair arms, then released. Maybe that would have been right. No, Frank said. It would not have been. Silence. Then Cole said, very quietly, You don't know what I did. No, I don't. But the thing in that unit didn't want your company. It wanted her. And you staying outside is the only reason I'm talking to you right now instead of making 2 calls to the sheriff instead of 1. Cole looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration. He was listening. Frank held up the second horseshoe. You're going back to your unit. I know. You're going to put this one in your left hand. The one you've been carrying goes in your right. You're going to hold both of them, and you're going to sit on the edge of that bed, and you're going to stay there. I know. Whatever comes to that room tonight, Frank said, is going to come because it's not finished. It's going to want to finish. Your job is to hold the iron and stay on the bed and say what you need to say if something needs to be said. He paused. Not what it wants to hear, what you should have said. Cole looked at the horseshoe. After a moment, he took it. He held both pieces of iron in his lap, one in each hand, and the quality of his stillness changed again, different from the wound-down clock stillness of before. This was something more deliberate. A man settling into a position. 17 years, Cole said. Frank waited. I knew it was wrong, the position. Half a second before I sent him, I knew something was off. I sent him anyway. Cole turned the horseshoes over in his hands. I've never said that out loud, told myself I didn't know, believed it, mostly, but knowing and saying it are different things. Frank looked at the man across the porch from him, 42 years old and road-worn and about as alone as a person got, and carrying that half-second for 17 years like a stone in his chest. He'd kept it unspoken long enough that it had become load-bearing, part of the architecture of who Cole Decker was. Saying it would not be a relief, not exactly. Not at first. Go, Frank said. Cole stood. He was steadier than Frank expected. Not the loose-limbed steadiness of a man who'd made peace with something, not yet, but the steadiness of a man who had identified the work and was walking toward it. Frank had seen that before, too. It was the best version of what a person could do with this. At the steps, Cole turned back. His face was not the clock face anymore. There was something in it that might have been fear and might have been readiness. And at this hour and in this place, Frank couldn't always tell the difference. "What if it's not enough?" Cole asked. "Then you'll still have said it," Frank told him. "That matters, even if you don't see it." Cole nodded. He crossed the compound without looking at Unit 4. Frank watched him go, watched him work the key and push open the door to Unit 6, watched the unit light come on through the curtains. He stayed on the porch. He was still on the porch 20 minutes later when the light changed in the curtains. Not off, not flickering. Just different, the quality of the light altering the way light will in a room when the room is no longer empty. Frank held his father's rebar across his knees and watched the unit and did not move. At 3:47, the quality of the light changed again, back to what it had been before. Ordinary lamplight in a plain unit. Frank exhaled. He waited another 10 minutes. Then he crossed the compound and stood outside Unit 6 and listened. No radio static, no voices. The July heat pressing in from all sides, the creek bed silent, the tree line unmoving. Through the door, nothing. The specific nothing of a room where something is finally finished. Frank went back to the porch and sat until the sky began to shift at the edges, that first suggestion of grey that comes before the grey itself. He did not sleep. He thought about Dot Reeves and what she had known and what she had done with the knowing for 15 years. And he thought about Cole Decker and a half-second in February 1970, outside a village he probably still saw in his sleep. And he thought about the difference between a boundary that keeps something out and a boundary that keeps something organized. He was going to need to think about that difference carefully. He suspected it was the most important thing he had figured out in 9 years, and he was very sorry it had taken 2 deaths to see it clearly. The porch light burned above him. The compound lay still. In Unit 6, Cole Decker sat on the edge of a bed with 2 horseshoes in his lap, looking at the space where something used to be. And his face, Frank would learn in the morning, was the most peaceful it had been in 17 years. The hollow had gotten what it came for. So had Cole in the end. Neither of those things had saved him. The Long Way Round, Scene 8, Monday, July 13th, dawn, approximately 6 a.m. He came out of the lodge at first light, not full light yet. The sun was below the tree line, and the sky was that particular shade of grey going pale that happens in July, about 20 minutes before the heat reasserts itself, before the morning birds start in and the insects pick up and the day becomes the day. Frank had always liked this window, not the piece of it exactly, the legibility of it. Things were what they appeared to be at this hour, without the ambiguity that came later. He did his rounds the way he always did. East side first. Unit 4 was as they'd left it. He stood in the doorway long enough to confirm that. Dot Reeves on the floor near the desk, her notebook open beside her, the single line written in her careful clerk's handwriting. Her reading glasses had come off and lay a few inches from her right hand. Frank had not moved them. He would not touch anything until the sheriff's deputy arrived. 9 years of doing this had taught him exactly what the careful conversation required, and part of that conversation was an undisturbed scene. He looked at her for a moment. She had been a competent, self-contained woman. She had spent 15 years carrying something that would have broken a lot of people faster. He respected that, even as he recognized it for what it was, the coping mechanism that had also been the kill shot. The Hollow had not needed to do much with Dot Reeves. Just provide a room and a notebook and enough patience to wait until she felt the need to write something down. He pulled the door to and went on. Unit 6. The horseshoe above the door was cold. Not summer morning cool, cold in the way it had been on Saturday night when Frank touched it and felt the warmth that had no business being there. That quality of wrongness in the iron itself. The wrongness was gone. The ward had held. What took Cole hadn't come from outside. Frank pushed the door open. The unit smelled like the rest of the compound, July heat and old wood and the faint underlying something from the creek bed. Cole Decker sat on the edge of the near bed the way the outline of him, glimpsed through the curtain 2 hours ago, had suggested. Both horseshoes in his hands, one cupped in each palm. His face was turned slightly toward the window, toward the curtained suggestion of light, and his expression was the kind that Frank had learned over 9 years to recognize from a doorway. Not sleep, not the absence of expression. Something finished, something that had gone as far as it was going to go, and had arrived at a place that was, for whatever complicated reasons, the right place. Frank stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not go in. He checked the horseshoe above the door again from the outside, confirmed it was seated correctly on the nail, cool and in place. Then he pulled that door to as well, and went to walk the fence. The fence line was 300 yards, north to south along the hollow's edge, and Frank walked it the way he'd walked it every morning for 9 years. His father had built this fence in 1975, the summer before he died, and had not called it a fence, had called it the boundary line. The posts were oak, the wire was ordinary galvanized steel, and the horseshoes were hung at each post, 6 inches above the wire, on nails his father had set himself. 41 posts. 41 horseshoes. Frank touched each one as he passed. Every ward was intact. He went the full length twice, north to south and back again, because that was the routine, and the routine mattered, and because he needed to look at the tree line from every angle. Everything was in place. The Hollow hadn't broken a single boundary this weekend, hadn't tested a single ward, hadn't rattled one post or shifted one horseshoe. 2 people were dead in his units, and the Hollow had not needed to touch the fence at all. It had found the gaps it needed inside the people themselves, and it had walked through them without any apparent effort. And the elaborate system of wards his father had built and he had maintained for 9 years had stood undisturbed and useless throughout. Frank stopped at the midpoint of the fence line and looked at the trees. No birds, no insects, no wind through the canopy. The creek bed was visible through the low brush on the far side of the fence, and it was still. He'd heard it go silent Sunday night, that specific moment when the water sound simply stopped, and he'd noted it, and now it was Monday morning, and the creek was still silent. 3 days from the last rain. There was no reason for it to be silent. The Hollow in the July morning, lit from above by a sun not yet over the canopy, completely still, completely quiet. Not the watchful quiet Frank had learned in his first years. That early quality had been tense, coiled, the sense of something scanning for openings. He'd grown fluent in that quiet. He knew how to read it. This was different. This was the quiet of something that had eaten and was resting, the Hollow in the posture of satisfaction. He had not encountered this before, not in 9 years, and standing here with the fence wire at his left hip and the still trees in front of him, he understood that he was reading a new kind of sign, and he did not yet have the full vocabulary for what it meant. He stayed at the fence line until the sun cleared the tree line to the east and the heat began. Then he walked back to the lodge. Inside, he went to the desk and picked up the phone. The sheriff's non-emergency line rang 4 times, and then a deputy answered, a young woman Frank didn't know by voice, and he gave her the information in the careful way he'd practiced. 2 guests. Both appeared to have died of natural causes overnight. He'd found them this morning on his rounds. He'd need both the deputy and the coroner's van. He hadn't moved anything. Yes, he would stay on the property. Yes, he understood they'd be there within the hour. He set the phone in the cradle and sat down. The top drawer of the desk was partially open. He'd left it that way since last night, after he'd looked at the card and closed the drawer, some back-of-the-mind thing making him leave it not fully shut. He pulled it open now and looked at the card again. Harold McKinnon. Willow's Bend. No phone number, just an address. His father's handwriting on the back. If things go wrong enough that you can't manage alone. Frank's father had given it to him the winter before he died. Frank had been 45 years old, already standing beside his father through 2 years of this, and the old man had pressed the card into his hand one evening and said those words. Frank had taken it and put it in the desk. He had others he gave out to guests when it seemed right. This one he had never given to anyone. 9 years later, it was still there. He had picked it up twice. Both times he'd put it back. He looked at the card without picking it up. Then he closed the drawer and stood and went to the kitchen for the coffee. He carried the mug out to the porch and sat in the near-rocking chair. The chair Cole had occupied 3 hours ago, though Frank didn't think about that consciously. He faced the compound, the units, the fence line, the tree line beyond. Unit 4, Unit 6, both pulled to doors, both iron horseshoes in their places. The sun was fully up now, orange going white, burning off what little coolness the night had left. Going to be a bad one. The humidity was back worse than yesterday, the air already thick and close, the kind of July day that made southern Ohio feel like the bottom of something. Behind him the lodge and the units, and beyond those the fence line with its wards in place, and beyond that, the hollow. 2 units to clean and reset, 2 calls to make to families he'd never met. The careful conversation with the deputy, the practiced answers to the questions, the way he'd learned to hold the truth lightly enough that it fit the shape of what people needed to hear. And then the next guests, because there were always next guests. The hollow pulled people who needed to be pulled, and they came down Old Mill Road, not quite knowing why, and they turned in at the sign, and Frank did what he could. He sat with his coffee and looked at the drive where the sheriff's car would appear, and he thought about what the fence line had told him this morning. And for the first time in 9 years, he was not sure it was going to be enough. The Long Way Round, Epilogue, Monday, July 13th, 11:03 p.m. The sheriff's car had left at 4 in the afternoon. The coroner's van had come and gone before that. Frank sat in his chair by the window with his father's rebar across his knees. The compound was dark. The porch light threw a circle of yellow onto the drive, and a few feet of gravel beyond, and everything past that circle was the July night, and the tree line was a solid wall at the far edge of the light. The siren had come at 8:47 and gone. Just the one. Frank had counted out of habit, the way he counted every night, and when he hit 10 seconds past the usual cutoff, and the second siren did not come, he had let himself breathe. He didn't know if 1 meant less than 2, or simply meant different. He was keeping the question for later, when he had the language for it. Both units were locked. He would not open them until morning. He sat. At 11:03 p.m., the sound came from the tree line. He had kept this watch for 9 years. He knew what the hollow sounded like. He knew the siren and the creak and the sounds the creatures made when they worked against the wards, that specific quality of pressure against iron. He knew the wind in the canopy and the settling of old wood and the particular silence that came before something moved through the compound. He knew every sound this place made. He did not know this one. Low and resonant. Not a voice, not the siren, not anything with a shape he recognized. Something settling. Something very large adjusting its position after a long time of holding still, the way old timber sounds when the temperature changes, when the wood finally accepts the new dimension it's been forced to. 4 seconds, then nothing. Frank sat. He sat until 1 o'clock in the morning. He did not hear the sound again. The creek remained silent. The tree line did not move. At 1 a.m. he went to the desk. He took a sheet of paper and his pen. He sat for a moment looking at the blank page, and then he wrote 2 words at the top and stopped. Harold McKinnon. He had looked at that card 100 times, had dialed the first 4 digits of the addresses exchanged twice, both times setting the receiver down before it connected. Had told himself each time that the wards were holding, that he had the measure of this place, that his father had built Ironwood to hold, and it was holding, and he could manage. He picked up the pen again. Something has changed here. I don't know yet what it is. But I know I've been wrong about what the wards are doing. They're not keeping it out. They're keeping it contained. There's a difference, and I should have seen it sooner. I lost 2 this weekend. I've lost guests before. This was different. I'm not asking you to come. Not yet. I'm telling you what I'm seeing, so that when I do ask, you'll have the context. I'll write again when I know more. He set the pen down and read it over. Then he folded the paper once and set it on the corner of the desk. He did not seal it yet. He went back to his chair and looked out the window at the porch light burning in the July dark, the tree line motionless, The creek bed somewhere beyond the fence, still silent. 3 days since Sunday night, not one sound from it. The water that had been running over those rocks since before his father was born, simply gone quiet. He thought about Cole Decker walking out of that hollow on foot in the dark, road flare in hand, the creek audible on his right. That was how this weekend had started. One man following a sound through the dark because it was the only landmark he had. Frank looked at the folded paper on the desk. The porch light burned. The tree line was still. Somewhere under that stillness, something had settled into a new kind of waiting. Not the hungry patience Frank had learned to read over 9 years of keeping this watch. Not that familiar coiled tension pressing against the wards. Something else. The waiting of a thing that is ready.